Chapter 11. My pulse raced. My face went cold. But I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't afraid. I'd always worried that I would be. I talked big. I pretended like a champ. But how many fights had I actually been in? One or two scuffles with other kids when I was younger? Some sparring matches in judo class? A part of me had always worried that when I got into the sky, I'd panic. That I'd prove myself to be the coward everyone claimed I was. Like the lies said my dad had been. But with a calm and steady hand, I eased up on the throttle and pulled into a turn, trying to position myself behind the enemy. I knew dogfighting techniques. I knew them backward and forward. I'd drawn them out in the margins of basically every set of notes I'd taken in class, regardless of the subject. I was still hopeless. I made the curve way too wide, and Hurley nearly smashed into me because we had banked at different times. Wow, Hurl said as the two of us recovered. This is harder than it seems, eh? The Krell ships chose Jurgen to attack, letting out a blast of glowing destruction for me. Or destructor fire. I tried to help, but my turn was too sharp this time. Jorgen, Ned, and the Krell ship all zipped away behind me in a sequence of dogfighting maneuvers. I blushed, feeling useless. I'd always assumed I'd just, well, take to this naturally, but I struggled to get my ship even pointed in the right direction. The Krell pulled into position again behind Jerkface, who cursed softly, and then did a near perfect twin S dodge. Suddenly, all of this became so much more real to me. That was one of my flightmates, and the enemy was doing its best to kill him. Nice work, Jorgen, Cobb said, but be careful with those maneuvers in the future. If you fly too much better than your companions, the Krell will immediately target you. If they can identify flight leaders, they attack them first. Shouldn't they attack the weakest pilots first? FM asked. The easiest to kill? But that wasn't the way the Krell thought. They always targeted the best pilots they could find, in an attempt to destroy our chain of command. I'll explain later, Cobb said, voice tense. Ned, you need to stick closer to Jorgen if you can. Make the Krell have to worry about you tailing if it tries to tail him. It was fortunate the Krell focused on good pilots, because Hurl and I would have made easy target practice. We could barely steer. Jerkface, though, he performed a perfect Alstrom loop, almost losing the Krell ship. Unfortunately, Jerkface's next spin wasn't as masterful. He performed it well, but when he pulled out of it, he ended up accidentally pointed toward the rest of the flight. I heard him curse over the radio as he tried to swerve, but that sent shots from the pursuing enemy ship right into our team. They scattered, ships twisting in all directions. Bim clipped Morningtide, the quiet girl with tattoos. Their ship bounced away from each other, but didn't hit anyone else. A few destructor blasts hit Rig's ship full on, but his shield held. He still screamed over the radio as the flashes of light rocked his Poco. I gritted my teeth, heart thumping as Hurl and I managed, finally, to head in the right direction. But that meant we passed among the scattering ships, and I nearly collided with Bim this time. Scud. I understood the Admiral's reasoning, but there was no way we should be up here fighting. At this rate, the only funeral pyres burned today would be our own. Poor Kimlin had leaned on our altitude controls and retreated some 500 feet below us. Jerkface barely kept ahead of the Krell, though he'd long since outpaced Ned. I pushed the throttle forward, and my ship compensated briefly for the G-forces. But after a few seconds, they hit me, pushing me back in the seat, making me feel heavier. Where are those reinforcements? Jerkface said as the enemy fired on him, blasting at his shield. Any moment now, Cobb said. I may not have a moment, Jurgen said. I'm going to try to get the ship to follow me up high so the AA guns can shoot it. Radio them. Done, Cobb said. The Krell ship's shield is still up, so we might have to keep an AA range long enough for the gunners to score several hits. Okay, I'll try. What's this red flashing light on my dash? Your shield is down, Cobb said softly. I can save him. I thought desperate. I have to save him. The two had gained a lot of altitude. My only hope was to get there fast, to tail the Krell ship and shoot it down. So I pointed my ship's nose up and slammed my throttle forward, hitting overburn. The G-force crushed me downward as I flew, and I felt myself grow heavier. It was the strangest sensation, far different from what I'd imagined. I could feel my skin pulling down, felt like it was going to slide off my face, and my arms grew heavy, making it difficult to steer. Worse, a wave of nausea hit me as my stomach was pulled downward. Within seconds, I started to black out. No. I was forced to grab the throttle and pull it back, slowing my ship. I barely managed to keep from losing consciousness. Below, the massive AA guns that protected Alta began firing, but they seemed clunky and slow compared to the zipping fighters. Explosions blasted the air behind Jorgen's little Poco and the strange, unfinished Krell ship. In a burst of light, an AA gun hit the Krell, breaking its shield, but it kept flying, right on Jorgen's tail. There was no way its next shot would miss him. No! At that moment, a single beam of pure light shot upward from below and pierced the Krell ship right through the center. It blasted apart in a flash of fire and debris. Jorgen let out a long sigh. Thanks for the reinforcements, Cobb. That wasn't them, son, Cobb said. Oh, Kimlin said. Did I get it? Oh, I got it. Are you okay, Jerkface? I frowned, looking down. That had been a shot from Kimlin? She'd positioned herself lower, over to the side, not to escape, but to get a good shot at the enemy without having to fire through the rest of us. I was, quite frankly, stunned. Jorgen sounded like he shared the emotion. Scud, he said. Quirk, did you just snipe a Krill fighter from long range? Cobb chuckled over the radio. Guess the file is right on you, Quirk. It's... She began, but then sighed. Never mind. Quirk it is. Anyway, yes, sir. What is this? Jorgen asked. She's the daughter of AA gunners from Bountiful Cavern, Cobb said. Historically, people with good accuracy on the smaller AA guns tend to make good pilots. The rotating seats of the small AA guns accustom one to moving and firing. And young Quirk here has some very impressive accuracy numbers. I wasn't even going to take the pilot's test, to be honest, she said in a conspiratorial tone, but the DDF recruiter showed up and asked me for a demonstration, so I had no choice but to give it to them straight. The best modesty is shown while bragging, as the saint said, and after they told me I might be able to do it, well, I'll admit I did get a tad excited by the idea. Suddenly, her place among us made sense. Vocal sound off, Jorgen said, sounding shaken. Status report, starting with anyone wounded. Rig said, I got hit. How hurt are you? Just shaken, Rig said. Though I threw up in my ship. Hurl laughed hard at that. Rigmarole, return to base, Jorgen said immediately. Morning tide, provide him with an escort. Everyone else, into line. We obeyed, now far more reserved. The banter died off as we watched the firefight in the distance, but soon our replacement came up around us and spelled us off. Cobb ordered us back to base, and we accompanied the other cadet flight that had been used as fake reinforcements. We landed near Riggs and Morning Tide ships. The two of them had already left, perhaps to take Riggs somewhere to sit and calm down. He could get rattled easily. I'd have to find him and see if he needed someone to talk to. As we climbed out of the ship, Hurl let out a whoop of excitement, ran for Kimlin. Your first kill! If you had aced before you're done with flight school, oh, Hurl! Kimlin obviously didn't know what to do with the praise as the rest of us gathered around, holding helmets and congratulating her. Even Jerkface gave her a nod and raised a fist of acclaim. I edged my way to him. That had been some awesome flying. Hey, Jerkface, I started. He spun on me, practically snarled. We need to talk, cadet. You are in serious need of an attitude adjustment. What? Right when I was going to compliment him? Coincidentally, I snapped, you are in serious need of a face adjustment. Is this how it's going to be? You insist on being a problem? Where did you get that flight suit anyway? I thought robbing corpses was illegal. Scud. He might have pulled off some awesome flight work, but that face, I still just wanted to punch him. You watch yourself, I said, wishing I had something to stand on to bring my eyes level with his. When you are broken and mourning your fall from grace, I will consume your shadow in my own and laugh at your misery. You are a weird little girl, Spin. Little girl? Little girl? Attention, Cobb shouted, limping up to our gathering. Little girl? I seethed, but, remembering how I'd been chewed out earlier, managed to keep my temper in check as I fell into line with the others. I pointedly did not look at Jerkface. That, Cobb said, was somehow the most embarrassing and inspiring display I've ever seen out of cadets. You should be ashamed. And proud. Grab your packs from our training room. Then meet me in Epsilon Hall of the flight school building for bunk assignments. You all need to hose down and grub up." The other cadets rushed off. I tried to linger, to ask after Rig, but Cobb ordered me on ahead. Seemed he didn't like people waiting for him while he limped. I still trailed after the others, feeling, well, like Cobb had said, actually, both ashamed and proud. I'd flown. I'd been in a battle. I was in the Defiant Defense Force. At the same time, my performance had been awful. For all my time bragging and preparations, I'd been more of a liability than an asset. I had a lot of work to do. And I would do it. I'd learn. I was a warrior, as Gran had taught me, and the warrior's way was not to run from failure, but to own up to it and do better. As we walked down the building's hallway, the PA system cracked on. "Today's flight was an incredible victory," Admiral Ironside said. "Proof of Defiant strength and tenacity. Remember what you fight for. Remember that if the enemy manages to get a lifebuster bomb into range, they can not only destroy this base, but everyone below, and everyone we love. You are the line between civilization and madness. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the new cadets of the as of yet unnamed Cadet Flights B and C. Their first sorties prove that they, with possible exceptions, are a group to be admired." With possible exceptions. Scud. How could the Admiral of the entire DDF be so petty? We walked to the classroom, where we left the packs of clothing we brought to Alta. As I swung my pack onto my shoulder, it banged into Hurl. The athletic girl laughed and made a wisecrack about how she'd almost crashed into me earlier, and I smiled. She seemed pumped up, rather than discouraged by our performance. As we walked toward the hallways of the cadet bunks, Hurl hung back with me so I wouldn't have to walk alone. Ahead, the others laughed at something Ned said, and I decided I wouldn't let Ironsides get to me. I had my flight as my allies, and they seemed, Jerkface accepted, to be decent people. Maybe here, for the first time, I'd find a place where I would fit in. We reached the cadet bunks. 2 hallways with rooms all along them. 1 hallway for the guys and a separate one for the girls. Everyone knew that there were strict no romance rules during flight school. No funny business was allowed until after graduation. Who had time for that anyway? Though I had to admit, Bim did look pretty good in a flight suit. I liked the blue hair too. We went with the boys to check on Rig. Their room was almost as small as the one I shared with Mom and Gran back at Igneous. The small chamber had a stacked-up set of 2 beds on each wall. Arturo, Ned, and Jerkface had plaques on their beds, and Rig was already in the 4th one. A cot had been pulled out for Bim. Poor guy. Rig was sleeping. Well, probably pretending to. But that meant he wanted to be alone for now. So the girls and I walked back to our hall. We located the room assigned to us, and it was just as small and cramped. It had 4 beds like the boys' room, and each had a plaque saying who was to bunk there. Kimmelin, Hurl, FM, and Morningtide, listed by their real names, but I preferred to think of them by their call signs. Except maybe Kimmelin. Did she really want to be known as Quirk? I'd have to talk to her about it. Regardless, at that moment, I was distracted by something else. There was no bed or plaque for me. Not even a cot. "Well, that's unfortunate," Kimmelin said. "Guess you ended up with the cot, Spin, once they bring it. I'll switch off with you every second night if you want." That girl was way too nice to be in the military. So where was my cot? I looked down the hallway and saw a Cobb limping up. 2 men in military police uniforms stopped in the hall behind him, then lingered. Not advancing on us, but also conspicuously waiting. I trailed up to Cobb, leaving the others in the room. "Sir?" "I tried. They won't listen." He grimaced. "No bunk for you. No meals in the mess hall." "What?" I couldn't have heard him right. "You are allowed in my classroom. I get ultimate say over that. But the rest of the DDF disagrees with what I've done. I have no authority over the facilities, and they've decided not to allocate resources to you. You can train, you can, fortunately, fly a Poco. But that's it. I'm sorry." I felt my face grow cold, anger rising inside me. How am I supposed to fly if I can't even eat? "You'll have to take meals down in Igneous," he said, "where your family requisition chits will work. You'll need to take elevators down each night, and then back up in the morning. The elevators can take hours, I said. I'll spend all my free time commuting. How am I supposed to be a member of the flight if I can't live with the others? This is outrageous, Cobb said, meeting my eyes. Agreed. Will you give up then? I took a deep breath and then shook my head. Good girl. I'll tell the others you were denied a bunk because of some stupid internal politics. He glanced at the MPs. Those cheerful fellows will show you the way out of the complex and make sure you don't sleep on the street. He leaned in. Just another fight spin. I warned you. They won't make this easy. I'll watch for a chance to fix this. Until then, stay strong. Then he hobbled away. I slumped against the wall, feeling like someone had cut my legs off. I'm never going to belong. I realized the Admiral will make sure of it. The MP took Cobb's departure as their cue to approach. I'm going, I said, shouldering my pack and walking toward the exit. They trailed behind. I wanted to say goodbye to the others, but I didn't want to explain. So I just left. I'd answer the questions in the morning. Suddenly, I felt exhausted. Don't let them see you bend, I thought, walking straight back. The MPs escorted me out of the building, and down one hallway we passed. I was fairly certain I spotted Ironsides watching to see that I left. Once I was outside flight school, though, the soldiers left me. So much for making sure I didn't sleep on the street. Maybe that was exactly what Ironsides wanted. If I could get arrested for loitering, she might be able to have me kicked out of the DDF. I found myself pacing outside the building, not quite wanting to leave, not wanting to abandon the others, and the sense of camaraderie I'd been imagining. Alone. Somehow, I was still alone. I just can't stand it, Cobb, a voice said nearby. Was that Jerkface? I inched closer to the building and looked around the corner. It was the back entrance to the school, and indeed, there was Jerkface standing near the doorway, talking to Cobb, who stood inside. Jerkface threw his hands up. How can I be flight leader if they don't respect me? How can I give orders when they call me that? I have to beat it out of them somehow. Forbid it. Order them to obey. Son, Cobb said, you don't know much about military, do you? I've been training for this my whole life. Then you should know. Respect doesn't come with a patch or a pin. It comes from experience and time. As for the name, it started to stick, so you've got two valid options. Ignore it, roll with it, and hope it goes away, or embrace it and accept it to take away the sting. I won't do that. It's insubordinate. I shook my head. What a terrible leader. Kid, Cobb began. Jerkface folded his arms. I have to go home. I'm expected for the formal dinner with the ambassador from Highway Cavern at 1900. Jerkface walked to an extremely nice-looking vehicle on the street. A private hover car with its own small acclivity ring? I'd seen them occasionally down below. Jerkface climbed into the vehicle and started it up. The engine purred, somehow more primal than the smooth power of a booster. Scud, I thought. How rich is this guy? His family must have tons of merits to afford something like that, and that left him too rich to bunk with the others, it seemed. He pulled away in a smooth motion. It seemed distinctly unfair that the thing I was denied, he tossed aside like it was a bad bit of rat meat. I shouldered my pack, then trudged off. I left the gate in the walled DDF compound, where another set of MPs marked my passing on a notepad. When I trudged down the wide street toward the elevators, my neighborhood was at the far edge of Igneous, so I really would spend hours and hours commuting this way. Maybe I could find some place to stay near the elevators below. It still made me feel sick. I walked to the elevator complex, but there were long lines, probably because of the problems they'd been having earlier. I braced myself for a wait, but then turned and looked to my left. Beyond the buildings, beyond the fields, though Alta Base itself had a shield and a wall, this improvised town, full of farmers who were defiant in another way, didn't have a fence. And why would it need one? The only things out there were dust, rocks, and caverns. A thought took me. It wasn't far. I stepped out of the line to the elevators and walked outward, past the buildings, past the crops. Farmers working there glanced at me, but didn't say anything as I left the town behind. This was my real home, the caverns, the rocks, and the open sky. I'd spent more time here since Father's death than I had down in Igneous. It was about a 30-minute walk to the cavern with the crashed ship, but I found my way without too much trouble. The opening was smaller than I remembered, but I had my light line, and I was able to lower myself. The old ship looked more broken down than I remembered. Perhaps it was because I'd just flown something new. Still, the cockpit was comfortable, and the seat reclined all the way. It was a stupid idea. If debris fell above, I could get caught in a cave-in. But I was too hurt, too wrung out, and too numb to care. So it was that, flying in the improvised bunk of a forgotten ship, I drifted off to sleep. Chapter 12. Waking up in the cockpit of a starfighter was basically the most incredible thing that had ever happened to me. Well, next to flying one. I stretched in the darkness, impressed by how much room the cockpit had. It was larger than those DDF ships. I engaged my light line for a little illumination and checked the clock. 04:30. 2.5 hours until I needed to report for class today. All things considered, I wasn't that tired. Just a little achy from something was sitting and watching me from the inside rim of the cockpit. The creature wasn't like anything I'd seen in the caverns. It was yellow, for one thing, flat, long, and kind of blobby. It had little blue spikes running along its back, making a pattern against its bright yellow skin. It looked like a big slug, the size of a loaf of bread, but thinner. I couldn't make out any eyes, but the way it folded up on itself, the front portion raised, reminded me slightly of a chipmunk? Like from the videos we'd watched in class of a few wildlife preservation caverns. "What are you?" I asked softly. My stomach growled. "And, equally important," I added, "are you edible?" It twisted its head sideways to look at me, though it still didn't seem to have any eyes, or a mouth, or, well, a face. It did that on a soft trill, a flute-like sound from its back spikes. If I'd learned anything from collecting mushrooms in the caverns, bright colors meant, "Don't eat me, or soon my brethren will be eating you, sapient one." Better to not put this strange cave slug into my mouth. My stomach growled, but when I fished in my pack, I found only half of an old algae ration bar. I might have had barely enough time to get down to Igneous for food, but that would have felt like slinking home, tail between my legs, beaten. The Admiral wanted to break me, did she? Well, she didn't know what she was up against. I was a world-class, highly trained, long-time expert rat girl. I leaned my seat up and dug around in the back of the surprisingly spacious cockpit. Usually every centimeter of room was needed in a fighter, though this one seemed to have a cargo spot behind the pilot's chair, and what looked like a fold-out jump seat for a passenger. Last night I thought I'd seen some old tools in here. Sure enough, I found a coil of plastifiber rope. The sealed cockpit had preserved it, though this stuff was pretty much indestructible anyway. I uncoiled some and unwound it into the string. The slug thing reminded me of the control panel, watching me. Remained on the control panel, watching me, occasionally tilting its head and making flute noises. "Yeah," I said. "Well, just you watch." I pushed the canopy open, all the way. I hadn't dared close it last night, for fear there wouldn't be any ventilation, and jumped down. As I'd hoped, I heard scuttling in the darkness, and found rat droppings near some mushrooms along the wall. I'd have preferred my spear gun, but in a pinch, a snare would work. Set with my ration bar as bait, I stepped back, pleased. The slug had moved into the wing of the old ship, and it fluted at me in a way that I chose to hear as inquisitive. "Those rats," I said, "shall soon know the wrath of my hunger, dispensed through tiny coils of justice." I smiled, then realized I was talking to a weird cave slug, which was a new low for me. Still, I had some time to kill, so I looked over the ship. Originally, I'd contemplated fixing the thing, but after finishing my test, I'd daydream an entire future in which I brought my own ship to the DDF and forced them to take it. Those imaginings now seemed far-fetched. This thing was not in good shape. Not just that bent wing or the broken boosters at the back. Everything that wasn't in the cockpit was scratched up, warped, or ripped apart. But maybe that was only on the outside. If the guts were good, then perhaps the ship was fixable. I fetched the toolbox. It had stood the test of time worse than the rope. It looked like a little moisture had gotten trapped in the box, but a rusty wrench was still a wrench. So I moved some rocks, then crawled in under the ship near the acclivity ring. I knew some basic mechanics, like all the students, though I hadn't studied that as hard as I had flight patterns and ship layouts. Rig always chided me, saying a good pilot should be able to repair her ship. I hadn't ever imagined that I'd be in an old cavern, lit only by the red-orange glow of my light line, trying to pry an access panel off an old piece of junk. I finally got the thing off and looked in, thinking back to my lessons. That's probably the booster intake and injection system, and that's got to be the stabilizer for the acclivity ring. There was a lot up in here that I didn't recognize, though I was able to locate the power matrix, the half-meter wide box that was the ship's power source. I unhooked it with some difficulty, then crawled out and used my light line to pull it from underneath the ship. The wires that hooked it to the ship were in good shape, surprisingly. Whoever had built this thing had made the electronics to last. The power matrix also used the same plugs we did now, which are the types we'd used in the fleet before crashing on detritus. Maybe that could somehow help me place its age. I crawled back down and looked inside the bowels of the ship. But what's this? I wondered, wrapping my knuckles in a large black box. Sleek, reflective despite the weight of years. It didn't seem to fit with the rest of the machinery. But then, who was I to say what did and didn't fit on a ship like this? On a whim, I opened up the tiny power matrix on my light line, then plugged one of the smaller cords from the ship into it. A soft dinging came from the front of the ship, and a light turned on inside the access panel. Scud. My light line's power matrix was obviously too weak, but if I had a real power source, I might be able to get some of the ship's functions up running. It would still have a bent wing and broken boosters, but the idea was exciting to me. I looked back up into the ship's innards. The slug was inside, wrapped around a cord and hanging there, staring down at me with a distinctively inquisitive posture. Hey now, I said, how did you get in there? It fluted a response. Was it the same slug or another? I crawled back out and checked. I couldn't see any other slugs around. I did hear a scrambling from near the wall, where my snare had caught a decently meaty-looking rat. See? I said, peeking down under the ship. The slug dropped onto the rocks there. And you doubted me. I skinned, gutted, and stripped the meat from the rat. The toolbox had a small micro-welder, and my light line's power matrix was more than enough for that. With it, and a piece of metal, I made a frying pan. And soon I had some rat cooking. No seasoning, but also I didn't have to go hungry. I can use the lavatory at the school, I thought. They didn't deny me that yesterday. And the lavatory had cleansing pods for washing up after PT. I could get some mushrooms in the morning, set up more snares, and I was really planning to live like a cave woman? I looked down at the cooking rat. It was either live here or commute every night like the Admiral expected me to. This was a way to control my life. They wouldn't give me food or a bunk? Fine. I didn't need their charity. I was defiant. We'll go ahead and read an extra chapter today. Chapter 13. Sure enough, when I got to the training building at 0630, the MPs didn't forbid me from going straight to the lavatory. I washed my hands, waiting for a moment when the other women were gone. Then I quickly stripped down, threw my clothes and underclothes in the clothing bay, and swung into the cleansing pod, a machine shaped roughly like a coffin, but with a hole on the small end. The cycle took less than 2 minutes, but I waited until the lavatory was empty again before climbing out and retrieving my now clean clothing. By 0650, I was seated with everyone else in our classroom. The others chatted animatedly about the mess hall's breakfast, which had included real bacon. I will let my wrath burn within me, I thought to comfort myself, until the day when it explodes and vengeance is mine. Until then, let it simmer. Simmer like juicy bacon on a hot skillet. Scud. Unfortunately, there was a larger problem. It was 0700 when the mock cockpits was still empty. Rig was late again. How in the stars had he been early to class every day for the last 10 years that managed to be late for flight school twice in a row? Cobb limped in, then stopped beside Rig's seat, frowning. A few moments later, Rig himself darkened the doorway. I checked the clock, anxious, then did a double take. Rig had his pack over his shoulder. Cobb didn't say a word. He just met Rig's eyes, then nodded. Rig turned to go. What? I said, jumping to my feet. What? There's always one, Cobb said. The day after the first battle. Usually that comes later in the training than it did for you all, but it always happens. Incredulous, I chased after Rig, scrambling out into the hallway. Rig! He kept walking. Rig, what are you doing? I ran after him. Giving up after one battle? I know you got shaken up, but this is our dream. No, Spencer, he said finally, stopping in the otherwise empty hallway. That's your dream. I was only along for the ride. Our dream? All that studying, all that practice, flight school, Rig. Flight school! You're repeating words like I can't hear you. He smiled. But I'm not the one who doesn't listen. I gaped. He patted me on the shoulder. I suppose I'm being unfair. I did always want to make it in. It's hard not to get wrapped up in the excitement when someone close to you dreams so big. I wanted to prove to myself that I could pass the test. And I did. But then I got up there, Spencer, and I felt what it was like when those destructors hit me. I knew. I couldn't do that every day. I'm sorry, Spencer. I'm not a pilot. Those words made no sense to me. Even the sound seemed strange leaving his mouth, as if he'd somehow switched to some foreign tongue. I thought about it all night, he said, sounding sorrowful. But I know, Spencer. Deep down, I've always known I wasn't cut out for battle. I just wish I knew what I was supposed to do now. Passing the test was always the end goal for me, you know? You're washing out, I said, giving up, running away. He winced, and suddenly I felt awful. Not everyone has to be a pilot, Spencer, he said. Other jobs are important too. That's what they say. They don't mean it. Maybe you're right. I don't know. I guess I need to think about it some more. Is there a job that involves only taking tests? I'm really good at that part, it turns out. He gave me a brief hug, during which I kind of stood there in shock, then walked off. I watched for a long while, until Cobb came to get me. Dally any longer, cadet, he said, and I'll write you up as being late. I can't believe you just let him go. Part of my job is to spot which of you kids will be best to help out down here, he said, instead of getting yourselves killed up there. He shoved me lightly toward the room. He won't be the only empty seat when this flight graduates. Go. I walked down into the room and settled into my mock pit as the implication of those words sank in. Cobb almost seemed happy to send one of us away. How many students had he watched get shot down? All right, Cobb said. Let's see what you remember from yesterday. Strap in, put in your helmets, and power on the holographic projectors. Get your flight into the air, flight leader, and prove to me it hasn't all bled out your ears onto your pillows. Then maybe I can teach you how to really start flying. And weapons? Bim asked, eager. Scud, no, Cobb said. They'll just shoot each other down by accident. Fundamentals first. And if we get caught in the air again, fighting? Arturo asked. I still had no idea how to say his call sign. Amphibious? Something like that. Then, Cobb said, you'll have to hope that Quirk will shoot them down for you, boy. Enough lip. I gave you cadets an order. I strapped in and engaged the device, but took one last look at Rig's empty seat as the hologram went up around me. We spent the morning practicing how to turn in unison. Flying a Starfighter wasn't like piloting some old airplane, like a few of the other outer clans used. Our ships not only had acclivity rings to keep us in the air, no matter our speed or lack thereof, Starfighters had powerful devices called atmospheric scoops, which left us much less at the whims of wind resistance. Our wings still had other uses, and the presence of atmosphere could be handy for many reasons, but we could perform a standard bank, turning our ship to the side and swinging around like a bird. But we could also perform some starship-style maneuvers, like just rotating our ship the direction we wanted to go, then boosting in that direction. I got to know the difference intimately as we performed both maneuvers, over and over and over, until I was almost tired of flying. Bim kept asking about weapons. The blue-haired boy had an enthusiastic, genuine way about him, which I liked, but I didn't agree with his eagerness to shoot guns. As I was going to outfly Jerkface someday, I had to learn the fundamentals. Slappy turns were exactly what had slowed me down in the skirmish yesterday. So if Cobb wanted me to turn, I'd turn. I'd turn until my fingers bled, until I rubbed the flesh from my hands and withered away to a skeleton. A skeleton who could turn really, really well. I followed the formation to the left, then jerked downward by reflex as Hurl turned too far in her axis and swooped too far in my direction. She smashed right into FM, whose invisible shield deflected the hit. But FM wasn't good enough to compensate for the shove, and she went spinning out of control the other direction. Both went down, smashing into the rock surface in a pair of twin explosions. Scud, FM said. She was a prim one, with her golden boot latches and her stylish haircut. Hurl, however, merely laughed. She did that a lot, enjoying herself perhaps too much. Wow, she said. Now that was an explosion. How many points do I get for that performance, Cobb? Points? You think this is a game, cadet? Life is a game, Hurl said. Yes. Well, you just lost all your points and died, Cobb said. If you fall into an uncontrolled spin like that, eject. How do I do that again? Ned asked. Seriously, Ned? Arturo asked. We went over this yesterday. Look at the lever between your legs. See the big E on it? What do you think that stands for? I figured it meant emergency. And what do you do when there's an emergency? In a fighter, you... Call you, Ned said, and say, Hey Arturo, where's the scudding eject lever? Arturo sighed. I grinned, looking at my window toward the next ship in formation. I could barely see the girl inside. Morning tide, her tattoo visible even with her helmet on. She glanced away sharply, not even a smile. Fine. Fly back in, Cobb said to us. It's nearly lunch. Time for lunch. Fly back in, Bim complained. Can't we just turn off the holograms and go grab some lunch? Sure, turn it off, get something to eat, then keep walking on back to where you came from, because I don't have time for cadets who refuse to practice their landings. Sorry, sir. Don't waste radio waves with apologies, cadet. Just follow orders. All right, flight, Jerkface said. Standard spread. Bank to heading 165. We obeyed, maneuvering back into a line, and flew toward the virtual version of Alta. Cobb, I said, are we going to practice recovering our ships from an uncontrolled descent? Not this again, he said. You'll very rarely be in such a situation. And so, if you are, I want you trained to yank that eject lever. I don't want you distracted by some bravado about saving your ship. What if we could have saved it, sir? Jorgen said. Shouldn't a good pilot do everything he or she can in order to protect their acclivity ring? They're rare enough that tradition states we should... Don't quote stupid tradition to me, Cobb snapped. We need good pilots as much as we need acclivity rings. If you're in an uncontrolled descent, you eject. You understand me? A few of the others gave verbal confirmation. I didn't. He hadn't contradicted the most important fact, that if a cadet ejected and scuttled their ship, they would never fly again. Maybe once I became a full pilot I could think about ejecting, but for now, I was never pulling that lever. Having this taken away from me would basically be the same as dying anyway. We landed, and the hologram shut down. The others started to pile out of the room toward the mess hall for lunch, laughing together about how spectacular FM and Hurl had looked when they exploded. Kimberlin noticed me hanging back in the room, and tried to stop, but Cobb gently steered her from the room after the others. I explained the situation to them, he said, stopping in the doorway. The elevator said you didn't go down to Igneous last night. I know of a little cave, about a half-hour's hike outside of town. I figured it would save some time to stay there. I've spent my life scavenging the tunnels. I feel more comfortable there. Suit yourself. Did you bring in lunch today? I shook my head. Do so from now on. I won't have you distracted by hunger during training. Then he left. Soon after, I heard voices in the distance. Laughter echoing from the mess hall. I considered getting in more training, but wasn't certain I was allowed to use the machines without supervision. I couldn't sit here and listen for an hour, though, so I decided to take a walk. It was strange how exhausted I could feel from flying, yet still have so much energy from sitting so long. I exited the training building, noting the two MPs stationed in the hallway. Were they really there just to keep me from snatching a role? That was a lot of resources for the Admiral to expend to satisfy her rivalry with an insignificant cadet. On the other hand, if you're going to pick a fight, you should fight to win. And I had to respect that. I left the DDF base and made my way to the orchard right outside the walls. Though there were workers here tending the trees, other people in uniforms walked among them, and benches had been set out along the path. It seemed I wasn't the only one who enjoyed the presence of real plant life. Not fungus or moss, but actual trees. I wasted a good 5 minutes feeling the bark and picking at the leaves, half convinced the whole thing would be made of some highly realistic plastic. I eventually stepped out and looked up at the debris field. As always, I could make out vast patterns, muted grays and lines in the sky, though it was too distant to see any specifics. A skylight was moving straight overhead, bright enough that I couldn't look directly at it without my eyes watering. I didn't spot any holes through the debris. That one moment with my father was the only time I'd ever seen into space itself. There were just too many layers of junk up there, orbiting in different patterns. What had the people been like? The ones who had built all this? Some of the kids in my clan had whispered that detritus was actually old Earth, but my father had laughed at the notion. Apparently the planet was far too small, and we had maps of Earth that it didn't match. But they had been human, or at least they'd used our language. Grand-Grand's generation, the crew of the Defiant and its fleet, had known detritus was here. They'd come to the old abandoned planet intentionally, to hide, though the landing had been far more destructive than they'd intended. I tried to imagine what it had been like for them. To leave the skies, to leave your ships, being forced to break into clans and hide. Had it been as strange for them to look up and see a cavern's ceiling as it still was for me to look up and see the sky? I continued to wander the orchard pathways. There was a certain rugged friendliness about the workers up here. They smiled at me as I walked past. Some gave me a quick, informal salute. I wondered how they'd react to hearing I was the daughter of Chaser, the infamous coward. As I rounded the orchard and headed back toward class, I passed a number of people in suits and skirts getting an official tour of the orchard. That was the kind of clothing you saw on overseers below. People rich in merits who might have been moved to deep caverns, the safer, better protected locations that might survive a bomb. People like Jorgen and his cronies. They seemed too clean. As I walked away, I spotted something curious. Between the orchard and the base was a row of small vehicle hangars. The door to one of them was up, revealing Jerkface's hover car peeking out. I glanced in, noting the polished chrome and baby blue colorings. Cool, soft, and obviously expensive. Why stash it here, outside the base? Probably doesn't want the other cadets asking for a ride, I thought. I resisted the urge to do something nasty to it. Barely. I passed through the gate, then arrived at our training room before the others. I walked straight to my seat, already feeling like it had been too long since I'd been in a cockpit. I settled in, sighing, happy. I looked to the side and found someone watching me. I jumped practically to the ceiling. I hadn't noticed Morningtide by the wall as I'd entered. Her real name was Magma, or Magna, I couldn't remember. Judging by the tray on the counter beside the Vishian girl, she'd brought her food back here and had eaten it alone. Hey, I said, what did they have? Smells like gravy, algae paste stew, potato mash, pork chops. Don't worry, I can take it. I'm a soldier. Give it to me straight. She just looked away, her face impassive. Your people are descended from Marines, right? I asked. On board the Defiant? I'm the descendant of people from the flagship myself. The engine crew. Maybe our great-grandparents knew each other. She didn't respond. I gritted my teeth, then climbed out of the seat. I stalked right over to her, forcing her to look me in the eyes. You have a problem with me? I demanded. She shrugged. Well, deal with it, I said. She shrugged again. I tapped on her collarbone. Don't taunt me. I don't care how fearsome the Vishian reputation is. I'm not going anywhere except up. I don't care if I have to step over your body to get there. I spun and walked back to my cockpit, settling down, feeling satisfied. I need to show Jerkface a little of that. Spencer the warrior. Yeah. Felt good. The others eventually piled into the room, taking their positions. Kimlin sidled over. Her long, curly, dark hair shook as she looked one way, then the other, as if trying to see if she was being watched. She dropped a roll into my lap. Cobb told us you forgot to bring a lunch, she whispered. Then she stood up and walked the other way, speaking loudly. What a lovely view of the sky we have. As the saint always said, good thing it's light during the day, otherwise we wouldn't be able to see how pretty daytime is. Cobb glanced at her, then rolled his eyes. Buckle in, he told the group. Time to learn something new. Weapons? Hurl asked, eager. Bim nodded as he climbed into his seat. No, Cobb said, turning. The other direction. He said it completely straight, and when I snickered, he glared at me. That wasn't a joke. I don't joke. Sure you don't. Before we get to turn on the holograms, Cobb continued, I'm supposed to ask how you feel about your instructions so far. What? Ned asked, squeezing his large frame into his cockpit. Our feelings? Yes, your feelings. What? I'm just surprised, Cobb, Ned said. Asking questions and listening is a big part of effective teaching, Nedder. So shut up and let me get on with it. Yes, sir. Flight leader, your thoughts. Confident, sir. They're a ragtag bunch, but I think we can teach them. With your expertise and my good enough, Cobb said. Nedder. Right now, a little confused, Ned said. And I think I ate too many enchiladas. Hurl. Bored, sir, she said. Can we just get back to the game? Two-headed dragon, stupid name. Amphisbaena, sir, Arturo said. I honestly haven't been highly engaged by today's activities, but I expect that practicing fundamentals will prove useful. Bored, Cobb said, writing his clipboard, and thinks he's smarter than he is. Quirk. Peachy. Pilots are never peachy, girl. We're spirited. Or, I added, briskly energized by the prospect of dealing death to the coming enemies. Or that, Cobb said, if you're psychotic. Morningtide. Good. The tattooed woman whispered. Speak up, cadet. Good. And I've got 3 lines here. Gotta write something. I can't bother of much, she said, her voice heavily accented. Good. Good enough, right? Cobb looked up from his writing board and narrowed his eyes. Then he wrote something on the board. Morningtide blushed and lowered her gaze. She doesn't speak English, I realized. Scud. I'm an idiot. The old ships had represented various Earth cultures. Of course there would be groups after 3 generations of hiding as isolated clans didn't speak my language. I'd never thought about it before. Bim, Cobb asked next. Boy, you have a call sign yet? Still thinking, Bim said. I want to get it right. My response. When do we learn weapons again? You can have my sidearm right now, Cobb said, if you promise to shoot yourself. I'll just write eager to get himself killed. Stupid forms. FM. Constantly amazed by the toxic aggression omnipresent in defiant culture, said the well-dressed girl. That's a new one, Cobb wrote. Sure the Admiral will love that. Spin. Hungry, sir. Also, I was stupid. Extremely stupid. I glanced again at Morningtide and thought back to how she'd always seemed standoffish. That had a new context, now that I listened for the thick accent and the misspoken words. The way she looked aside when someone talked to her. All right, that's done. Finally, Cobb said. Buckle in and fire up the holograms.